What our esteemed audience doesn't really know is that Tavo here is the life of the party. He is a barrel of laughs. I'd call him a giggling lad. And yet, he's a very serious man on this podcast. I'm going to see if I can humiliate myself enough to get at least a small crack of a smile out of him. Octavio, I'm going to need you to ask me to do my Australian accent.
Oh dear. Alex, what does an Australian accent sound like according to you?
Let me show you exactly what an Australian sounds like. Oh, hey the new! Get your prawn off my barbecue!
I somehow feel that wasn't necessarily Australian.
Well,
I don't know where I'm getting that from.
This is my whole point. I think that that's basically the English language equivalent of what most Europeans do when they pretend to be Mexican, especially in their clothing. Nothing to do with what's actually going on. It's a stereotype that is almost entirely not based in reality. I'm specifically thinking of, I don't even know if it's true or not, but it's the world is weird enough for it to be true. Ukrainian recruitment video in Spanish trying to recruit Latin Americans to the Ukrainian army. And it's a woman wearing what looks like a sombrero, and she's sort of making like Mexican style noises is what I'll call it. And she's basically
Mexican style noises.
Yes,
okay.
Exactly. That's the most generous way I can put it. And she's wearing this sombrero with massive air quotes around it, and it's the classic sort of like bright orange, flat, like rimmed, and like little baubles, like little white baubles around it. So a massive sombrero with baubles, something that has never been seen in this.
Other than in Jim Carrey in The Mask.
Exactly. But that one's good because I think that one's pretending to be something else. I think he's Cuban Pete, which
right.
we'll ask Cuba the podcast whether they think it's accurate. But that's an interesting sort of thing because today we're going to talk about who owns Mexican culture. And I think we can very, very clearly say that, and I think the counterintuitive thing is people who don't understand Mexican culture, according to Mexicans, can own it because a sombrero incident back when I was at university was a really interesting trigger point to start talking about who owns Mexican culture. Basically, in the University of East Anglia, a Mexican restaurant, but most Mexican restaurants in the UK aren't owned or run by Mexicans, was giving out sombreros of the style I've just described. And the Students' Union said it was cultural appropriation, and so actually you were banned. The Mexican restaurant was banned from handing out sombreros. And I think that went a bit too far in the other direction. And the Mexican Society in the UK, I think it's called MexSoc UK, actually published a national press release saying that actually Mexicans in the UK were okay with this, and that ultimately Mexican culture was about acceptance and about people basically being themselves around Mexicanness, which is very against this idea, mostly I'd say from the US principally, which says that only certain people can wear certain garments and only certain cultures can be performed or used or deployed by certain people. Now, obviously, there's a lot more complexity when it comes to Mexican culture that we'll be diving into. We've gone from the most ridiculous expression of it, but now things are about to get really tricky. Let me just preface this whole conversation with the fact that Mexican culture is such an enormous topic that we've decided to focus in on a teeny tiny bit of it, which is Mexican clothing and apparel. And you'll see how far we can go on just this basis. But if you want to hear about Mexican food and its relationship to the world and to culture, I'd suggest you subscribe to the Mexico Political Economist because you might be reading something exactly about that in the coming days.
And we should definitely do a podcast on food as well. So it's interesting what you mentioned, Alex, about the University of East Anglia and how Mexicans in Britain said, no, actually, it's okay. You can do this in the UK. We don't mind. Because that would be sort of my sentiment. But I remember when AMLO, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the former president of Mexico, started saying that he expected or he demanded that the Spanish crown ask for forgiveness for the crimes committed 500 years prior, whatever. I remember talking to someone about that and saying, like, this is ridiculous. Like he's looking for grievances where there are none. And someone said to me, well, maybe there's an issue where for people like you there are none, but there might be a subset of the population who does identify with that, who does feel that they are part of an indigenous group of people who has been affronted and who deserves and wants an apology. So, the Mexican Association in the UK, are they representative of all Mexicans? I don't know.
No, they're almost certainly not. What's interesting is, and this is the interesting debate always going on within Mexican democracy, we'll actually end this podcast with the most recent expression of this, is the fact that when we talk about Mexican culture, what we're actually talking about is a culture of miscegenation. Makes sense, I think, strategically for López Obrador to have asked the Spanish crown and the Pope, who, by the way, did apologize. It's important, I think, that they asked the institutions rather than the cultures or the people of Spain to apologize for being intrinsically bad, because ultimately, I think López Obrador understands that Mexico is a combination of myriad quantity of cultures and a clash of civilizations and a melding of civilizations that makes victimhood and ownership very difficult to unpick. Let me start with one specific form of Mexican material culture that I think really illustrates it, which is one that's really close to my heart because it takes me back to my childhood. It's a garment that is used mostly by men, usually made of linen, sometimes cotton, and it is a hot weather garment. It's called a guayabera. It's fascinating because it is the formal wear of Caribbean and coastal Mexico, Venezuela, Cuba. It's a very broad swath because ultimately it's of Spanish inspiration, so to speak. It's not an indigenous garb in the sense that it was made by the peoples who were native to this land before the Spanish arrived, but it's native to the Americas in the sense that it took the styles of the Spanish and converted them to the needs and ways of this particular part of the world. And what's interesting is it's the formal wear of Cuba and it's the formal wear of places like Yucatan, the Yucatan Peninsula, and Veracruz, where my family's from Jalapa. Nobody knows where it's really from. I'm obviously going to say it's from Veracruz because that's the truth. Nothing to do with the fact my family's from there. But what I think is most important is that it is the most elegant thing you can wear. I have very clear memories of being a young boy, being dressed up in a guayabera and having my aunties go, "Qué elegante, qué guapo." And it made such a big difference to how I felt in that garb, because you go to the UK, for example, you wear the same shirt in a formal setting, and people will say, and this happened in my experience, people will come up to you and say, "The sandwiches are delicious, could I get another drink?" It doesn't compute as an elegant piece of clothing outside of these areas. I think it's becoming more and more accepted, especially given that the Cubans in Miami especially have really spread its influence into the United States. There's cases of Hemingway famously wearing it. It's a big deal in that part of the United States, but it's still mostly limited to that Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean world. And yet it is ultimately a relatively modern piece of clothing. It is basically just a dress shirt with embroidered patterns, often very subtly embroidered. So you can't, sometimes from a distance, it'll look like a loose-fitting white shirt, but it is perfect for the weather. And once you've got the right mentality for it, it's a very, very sophisticated and elegant thing to wear. There's only one issue, though. It's been polluted by politics.
Yeah, so when I think of the guayabera, I definitely think of it as a wonderful sort of piece of formal wear for sure, particularly the right thing for a very hot climate, which a suit is definitely not. But yes, I definitely also have in recent years come to associate it with a certain brand of politician as well.
Yes, and it's not just you. It is actually a phenomenon that we've seen. It can be traced back to a very specific man in Mexican history, and that's Luis Echeverría. We've talked about him a lot on this podcast, mostly when we talk about the failures of the Mexican economy in the 1970s. But now we're going to talk about him as a power broker and a fashion icon. I think ultimately one thing that we've got to understand when we talk about culture, power, and clothing within that context is how interlinked they are. Politics is intrinsic to culture and to clothing. And Echeverria was the perfect example of this. He inherited basically the presidency from men who wore suits in the sort of very old-fashioned style, very European, very American in their cuts. And he came out, Echeverria, wearing a traditionally Mexican piece of clothing, the guayabera. And because he was the most powerful man in Mexico, it was sort of the effect that you had back in the day when the smoking jacket became popular, or when the Prince of Wales wore a particular piece of clothing. It became not only the fad, it became the new norm. And that is what happened in Mexico. What's interesting is it coincides with this moment of third world solidarity, where Mexico was trying to reach out to other parts of the world beyond the United States and the West. I don't know if this sounds familiar to listeners in the present day, but what they did was they did that through culture. And that's a tradition that really extended into the 90s, even after that phase, after Echeverria was gone. The Cubans, for example, said we shun the suit not only as imperialist trappings, but because it's inherently uncomfortable to wear in a tropical country. And it brings me to a relatively modern phenomenon, which is APEC. Do you know what APEC is? Do you remember that?
Asian Pacific Economic something?
Exactly right, yes. The Asia Pacific Economic something. And what basically it unites the countries around the Pacific Basin, so Asian countries, the Americas, and they all come together in a big summit. The Indonesians were the ones who invented this new way of doing things, which was to promote their own cultural garb, the batik. In 1994, they made all the world leaders their own batik. And so everyone wore it. And what's interesting is this was the Indonesian government saying, this is our culture, we're promoting it, we want everyone to see how beautiful it is. But the Americans didn't understand. And specifically, I think Barack Obama didn't understand years later, because it was seen as fancy dress, I think. There's a weird division, I think, between the fancy dress that people reject, when people basically say you shouldn't be wearing indigenous garb at a fancy dress party because it's offensive. Where does it stop being fancy dress? And when is it an expression of when is it a celebration of someone's cultural expression? Well, Obama, one could say, as a Hawaiian man, hosting APEC in Hawaii, was probably more torn than one would think when he opted not to use Hawaiian dress. That is either indigenous Hawaiian garb or the aloha shirt, that is the Hawaiian shirt that we all know and love. Because I think as a liberal, there is a sort of weird amount of guilt around how one interacts with things that are beyond the norm. But I think, weirdly, that becomes a sort of oppressive presence, this liberal cringe to other people's cultures where they've become untouchable and distant, are almost the opposite of what Mexicans feel about their culture, which is it should and can be absorbed into the many different ways that we work. And so, whereas an American president might feel a bit awkward wearing someone else's garb, in Cuba and Mexico, it became almost obligatory for leaders to wear the guayabera. And when Obama turns up in his tan suit, I think Fidel Castro was the one who made fun of him, saying, "What this sort of shows the American intransigence we've all come to know and love."
Yeah, I mean, definitely, it's this crazy thing where because the European world basically came to dominate the whole world. They kind of set the standards on what is formal dress, right? So for men, it's tuxedos, it's suits, and now anytime there's sort of no winning for the U.S. There was no right choice for Obama, because if he'd worn something Hawaiian, he would have been, there would have been very correct claims of you can't, appropriate that or use that because it's not like Hawaiian people have been given all the rights or were historically given all the rights they deserved. Yeah. If you use the Indonesian one, then suddenly he's being sort of maybe he's appropriating that culture.
But then when Indonesian.
He is Indonesian, but then if he uses the one that is usually used in the U.S., well, he's being imperialist because that's the one we all use. So there was absolutely no way of winning for the man.
So really, you'd think, oh, silly Americans, but actually Mexico's also got its hang-ups too. Mexican liberalism, that is the sort of more center-right version of it, also has its own cringe around guayaberas because they are associated with Echeverria, who is associated with Mexican left-wing nationalism. Can you think of any other left-wing nationalists recently in power?
I can think of one for sure.
Yeah. And before he became president, he was actually the center of a controversy during the presidential campaign. This was a debate in Mérida, the capital of the state of Yucatan, another place that claims to be the home of the Guayabera, incorrectly, but we'll let them have it for the sake of this story. And so it's the home of the Guayabera. It's swelteringly hot. Like, if you have not been to Mérida, I cannot explain to you the sauna you walk into. If you wore a suit in a place like that, I think you should legally be categorized as insane, legally insane, for wearing a suit outside in Mérida, Yucatan. And so when he was out on the campaign trail, he would wear his guayaberas, which, by the way, López Obrador used to get done in his coastal state of Tabasco. So we see these sort of like this tension, right? It's about who owns this. There's always this conversation about who owns the guayabera, but there's also an acceptance that everyone gets to wear it across this part of Mexico, hot, humid, and just incredibly difficult to wear a suit in. And so candidate López Obrador says, I'm going to go to the debate in Mérida in my guayabera. It's culturally the right thing to do. It's physically the right thing to do. And the electoral authority said, no, you've got to wear a suit. And that just became a massive controversy and fertile ground for some terrible puns because, headlines saying it's bound to get heated and stuff like that, because it was all about the different reasons why people wear guayaberas. It's a functional part of Mexican culture.
But now, I mean, there is an element also of the guayabera has a certain sort of set of connotations, one of them being, of course, left-wing, historically being sort of used by left-wing politicians like Echeverria. There is an element of a link to sort of being more connected to the people in a way, generically speaking, of a particular region. So one of the things that the Mexican Federal Electoral Institute tries to do is sort of minimize any form of undue propaganda that one party might carry out that another one hasn't been able to carry out. So by limiting what you wear and making everyone wear the same thing, it was sort of stopping AMLO from doing that kind of, let's say, propaganda. But on the flip side, if it's what you usually wear, what it makes sense to wear, then it's not propaganda. So where exactly is the line?
Well, what you've basically outlined there is what the opponents of López Obrador said informally, which is wearing the guayabera has almost become synonymous to populism, and it's almost like a dog whistle. But that's not the excuse that the Electoral Institute used. Its excuse was technical, and it was made to sound technical because that's neutral, quote unquote. They said, it'll ruin the lighting, which is designed for dark suits, which are the sort of historically seen as the more formal way of doing it in a tiny cold island in the North Atlantic called Britain. But they also said that the studio was already acclimatized to be cold because, air conditioning and everyone's supposed to be wearing suits. And so if you wear a guayabera, you'll actually be cold, which is actually the revelation of some form of insanity, which I think reveals something that seemingly crazy lefty academics mean when they talk about colonial structures, right? Like, we're always talking about how, like lefties are always sort of being a bit too sensitive about cultural sensitivity and all that. But here I think it's almost like the perfect example of how colonial structures are actual physical structures sometimes, and they can be oppressive in a literal way, like in terms of the heat. It's insane to think that clothing made for the place that they were in was deemed inappropriate because of the expensive infrastructure they've built around it, meant to cater to foreign fashions and to foreign conceptions of elegance. And so nothing against the suit, lovely to wear a suit, but it does make a lot more sense in a place like the UK, where it was more or less invented, because it's a cold, drizzly place. It makes perfect sense to wear something like that there. But they built these institutions and these physical structures to create almost like bubbles that recreated the climate of the UK in an incredibly hot and tropical place.
I mean, that's a really interesting point. Now, the problem is, of course, as you say, Mexico is a place culturally of long-standing mixing of peoples and of cultures. So to a degree, as in many places, the suit has become Mexican. So, to one degree, it's not just the colonialism, it's just long-standing rituals and traditions that have become appropriated by Mexicans too.
Yes, that is true. And I think this is where we can see a bit of a mixing in the struggles that we see. We've got this sort of we'll call it establishment, if not colonial, resistance to the suit, but also we see the rise of women. Es tiempo de mujeres, it's the time for women, is Claudia Sheinbaum's sort of unofficial slogan. And the rise of women in politics has also led to the rise of a different form of apparel that I think is fascinating in its own way, because with guayaberas, we'll call it a Hispanic American invention, very much product of the post-colonial age. Whereas what we're going to talk about now, what Mexican women in politics wear, also very politicized, also very much associated with a certain form of doing politics, is an indigenous Mexican garb. And it has been mostly introduced into politics by women.
Definitely. And I think this kind of sort of clothing has become quite famous globally, thanks to Frida Kahlo. Now, Frida Kahlo used to wear and paint herself wearing tehuana, which is a traditional outfit from the Oaxaca state of Mexico, in the Istmo of Tehuantepec, specifically part of Mexico, of Oaxaca, so the southernmost part of the state. But what's interesting to me, and I think it brings to the surface some of these incongruences, is the fact that she wore this out of respect for the indigenous past of the country, also sort of linking herself to her own indigenous heritage.
Quick question. Was she indigenous by heritage?
So partially, and this is where it gets interesting, she would say these things and would talk about how she was linked to it and blah, blah, blah. And of course, she's married to Diego Rivera, and he says all these things as well. There's this instance of Diego Rivera talking about the need to destroy all the colonial buildings in Mexico and rebuild true Mexican buildings, blah, blah, blah. Frida Kahlo was also very much in this spirit. But her father was German, and her mother was, yes, of indigenous descent, but most Mexicans are of indigenous descent in one way or another. And she was of Purépecha descent. The Purépecha people are not in Oaxaca. They're nowhere close to Oaxaca, definitely not nowhere close to the Istmo de Tehuantepec. So it seems like another type of appropriation.
Yes, I think that's something that you really hit upon that often gets ignored when we say indigenous, sort of capital I, big shining letters, indigenous, as if it's a big thing. It's almost a stereotype to say that it's not a monolith, but we keep talking about indigenous culture and indigenous peoples as a monolith. Mexico, for example, has 68 recognized indigenous languages, but there's 400 variations and dialects, and you can really tell, in the same way that you can chuck a stone in Germany and they speak a different form of German. It's equal or even more intense in Mexico when you talk to people who speak Nahuatl in one part of the country or Mije in one part of a state. They won't be able to understand the neighboring town. And so even though it's the same language, they have their own mores, they have their own way of doing things, and they've got their own garb. And I think that's really important to conceive of. One of the beautiful things that happens when you go to a wedding in some of these towns, specifically in the mountain ranges in the north of Oaxaca, the Ayuk people, the Mije, might marry someone from a neighboring town. And part of the religious ceremony implies the woman having to dress in the garb of the neighboring town. And so this cultural exchange is happening within a few miles of each other, technically within the same linguistic group, and yet it is a form of cultural assimilation and miscegenation that we sort of reserve for the big clash of civilizations between Europe and the Americas. But this is happening at a micro level, and it's expressed through this traditional garb. So now imagine how complex it gets when non-Indigenous peoples get involved. And that's probably where we're going to end today, because it gets pretty scandalous. I'm going to start with the usual scandal. Another day, another scandal. Recently, Adidas was sued for plagiarizing indigenous patterns onto its shoes. Yet we see this about once a year. Sometimes it'll be Gucci, sometimes it'll be Louis Vuitton, but there's always issues with big companies stealing indigenous patterns for their own profit. That's not particularly new. Neither is the fact that when it comes to garments, there's a big issue recently with Asian imports, a lot of the things that they'll tell you is Asian imports will usually be polyester, and they'll usually be literally printed prints rather than sewn in into the fabric. And so that's something, if you're out and about looking for Mexican clothing, that's a big deal. But the thing is, the solution isn't that obvious. You'd say, the solution is let's just get indigenous people to make the stuff and we share the profits with them, right? Which a lot of companies do. Wrong. That's a different form of conceiving of property. And I think this is what brings us into who owns culture truly, because it's not only who owns a certain pattern or who owns the right to wear something. In Mexico, as we've said, it doesn't really matter if you wear it. In fact, a lot of indigenous communities make a lot of their income through selling their traditional wares to people for tourists and other Mexicans to wear. There's no issue with that. The issue is we might even have an issue. The problem is we might even have an issue with how we conceive of property in the first place. It's a very Western-centric conception of ownership. And what's funny is we've talked about this in previous conversations at this podcast when we talked about Benito Juarez and whether he was left or right wing as a liberal in the 19th century. One of the big things about Benito Juarez was that he was an indigenous president, also from Oaxaca, though a Zapotec man rather than any of the other peoples who lived there. And what was interesting is, as a liberal in the European sense, he said, we're going to do individualism and all property is going to be individualized. And so we're going to break up indigenous land ownership, which is communal, and we're going to make everyone own their own thing, which was actually a cultural disaster for loads of indigenous communities across the country. This is also an issue when it comes to clothing and patterns. Patterns, as happens everywhere in the world, as we see with tartan, as we see with different fraternities in the United States, what patterns and clothes you wear identify you as a group. And there's no difference when it comes to indigenous patterns and indigenous clothing. And so when you come in as a company and say, let me buy the rights to reproduce this, who do you buy them from? You could say, who do you buy them from? Because in some towns in Mexico run by indigenous councils, they run on a system of usos y costumbres, which is broadly sort of native governance on the basis of tradition. And they will not have private property of the land there. You can own the land as an individual, but it's sort of leased to you by the community, and it's only yours as long as you work it, which I think is people would call it socialist, but I think it's just the way things have historically been until quite recently all around the world. And so that's more or less how it works with the patterns that they make. The whole community gets together and makes these clothes and they sell them. But if you're a company that comes from outside and says, who can I buy the rights to these patterns from? The answer is actually really difficult. In the same way that happens in all neighborhood councils, not everyone's going to be in agreement. And if you don't have everyone's agreement, maybe you don't actually have consent to use these patterns. So you've got this massive debate going on between the government, indigenous communities, companies, and then amidst all this, in we throw a grenade into the works. Here comes AI to make things even more difficult. Because when you inject AI into this debate, you make things so much more difficult, especially after a recent Supreme Court ruling here in Mexico, which said that anything made with AI is not susceptible to author's rights, because even though you might have typed in the prompt, the machine made it. And so no one owns that image. That is, of course, hooray, a victory for artists and for human individuality. But wait, that's again a very clear link to this conception of individual ownership. And one of the issues that we might start to see, it's already an ongoing debate, is when you feed AI indigenous patterns and say, give me an indigenous, you don't even say the culture you're talking about or the peoples you're specifically referring to, you say, make me an indigenous Mexican dress, design me a dress, ChatGPT, it'll regurgitate something void of meaning, void of the historical baggage and traditions that most patterns have. But in a certain way, it's also void of the responsibility you have to that community or to any community because you've whitewashed it. You've put it through AI, you've stripped it of its humanity, of its of its property right, of its author's rights, and you've made it something new. That's literally the debate that's going on at the moment in Mexico. So sadly, I don't have an answer for you, but I want to end on a different thing, a different sort of scandal that brings us all the way back to the beginning of this conversation, which was what happens when we introduce different parts of culture, a very diverse culture like Mexico's, into places where it's not usually in. Yesterday, at the time of recording, that is, the new elected Mexican Supreme Court came to power. The lead up to this was already controversial, very much in the line of López Obrador and his guayabera at the debate. The newly elected president of the Supreme Court is an indigenous man. He's a Mixtec man from Oaxaca, Hugo Aguilar. And he said, not only am I going to speak a bit more Mixtec than we've had, which was zero in the Supreme Court, not only are we going to defend indigenous people's right, which has been basically his entire career until now within the law, communal property, etc., lots of controversy there. We'll leave a few articles from the Mexico Political Economist about that in the show notes. But what was interesting is what really caused controversy was when Hugo Aguilar came in and said, also, I won't be using the black robes of the judges that we've usually had, where I'm going to be wearing traditional Mixtec clothing. And people went insane. They said it was just the last straw. It was a complete lack of respect for the institutions that Mexico had created. It was basically the beginning and the end of justice in Mexico, because this man wanted to wear the clothing that was appropriate to his culture. Now, of course, we can have this debate, right? Because Mexican culture is just as much the institutions that have been created over time. These black robes do have historical reasons for which we wear them, and the judges in Mexico and the Supreme Court have worn them for centuries now. In the same way that there are other good reasons for someone like Hugo Aguilar to wear his traditional garb there, because he's trying to break with the past. It is a new beginning for Mexican justice, and his clothing would represent that, says he.
What's interesting there is, well, there's plenty of things, but one that comes to mind for sure is Mexico doesn't have an official language. Of course, pretty much everyone speaks Spanish, if not everyone, but it doesn't have an official language because in law, Mexico is incredibly progressive. As far as the written law is concerned, Mexico is outstanding. The reason there is no official language in Mexico is to acknowledge that there is no single dominant culture in the country. Now, that's de jure. De facto, there is a dominant culture in the country, and it's a culture that speaks Spanish. Everything is done in Spanish, and it follows very many overwhelmingly European lines of thinking. Sure, peppered with lines of thinking of other places, many of them Mexican indigenous ones, but it is a fundamentally European Spanish sort of line of thinking and doing things. This man doing this is interesting because he's actually following the law. He's saying there is no official language. Of course I can do this. And of course I can wear this because this country is about plurality. That's what we don't have an official language. That is why we have never allowed for, an official dominant culture to exist. However, many people have argued that the reason that Mexico has been successful at remaining as a unified country is, particularly in the course of the 20th century, where the PRI was so successful at sort of being a hegemonic power with huge political stability, was the fact that it imposed sort of a uniformity around the country. What happens when you start taking away that uniformity, that imposed and maybe unfair uniformity? You leave the door open for a lot of debate. You leave the door open for a lot of dissent, which is wonderful, but it can also be incredibly dangerous. And I think this might be a little bit of what's behind the concerns of some of the critics.
I would say that it's dangerous mostly because throughout history, what we see is as soon as we open up the debate towards broader diversity, the people who make the most aggressive advances against it tend to be the people who have the most to lose, which tend to be the elites within that system. That, to me, is always something to be analyzed, to be studied. It's not unique to Mexico. But what I think is interesting here is that we've come round to answer the question, who owns Mexican culture, in the weirdest way possible. We've circled down to a position where even you, as a representative of a certain part of Mexican culture, aren't allowed to own it in certain spaces. There's a sort of the story of Hugo Aguilar in the Supreme Court ends in a weird and kind of sad way, which is he conciliates and he goes down a middle of the way route, which is he does wear a black robe, but it's embroidered in some beautiful floral patterns. And that was still criticized. And I think that's the great debate around culture in a very hyper-diverse country like Mexico, plagued with inequality. As soon as we start having debates about who needs to be where within a society and what cultures deserve to be in certain places, we definitely do open up the door to a lot of overhauling of a lot more than we actually initially bargained.
So maybe a question there for you, Alex. When I think about this, so the fact that Hugo Aguilar, a man of mystic heritage, a mystic man, can wear it, that makes sense to me. But then you look at people who might not necessarily be entitled to wearing it. If we're following the strict sort of who owns what, assuming that you actually do own it, which is a whole can of worms. But when you look, for example, at the current president, who is, her name is Claudia Sheinbaum. It's not the most mystic of names or indigenous of names. She wears indigenous or clothes that are significantly inspired by indigenous designs. And this reminds me of a moment in history that's nothing to do with Mexico. But if you go back to 19th century modern day Hungary, at the time, the elites were fighting the Austro-Hungarian emperor. This is going to be relevant, I promise. And they were fighting the Austro-Hungarian emperor for their rights, right? And at this time, for a bunch of other reasons, the whole debate around who had what rights started to be framed in terms of national rights. Okay, so they start, looking at the history of their people and saying, we are historically Magyar people, and we're so proud of being Magyar and Magyar culture and so on. And you had these ridiculous instances where the nobility of Hungary didn't speak Magyar. They hadn't spoken it for centuries. They spoke French and German, mostly French. So then, because they had to sort of live up to the story that they were telling about, their heritage and who they were, they started to learn Hungarian, which is a notoriously difficult language to learn, very late on in life. And then they would only speak around, Austrians and Czechs of the empire in their version of Hungarian, which Hungarian peasants who actually did speak Hungarian couldn't understand for their life because it wasn't at all like what actual Hungarian should be like. And I feel this is what might be happening a little bit when you look at indigenous clothing or the use of indigenous clothing by people who are not necessarily indigenous in Mexico.
That to me is the real debate. I don't think that this American version of who deserves and who's entitled to wear things is really applicable in Mexico. Because what I think is wonderful is perhaps the biggest form of ownership of culture is how you get to perform self-determination. Now, the Mexican state, which again is a problematic statement to make in the first place, but the Mexican state does a funny thing, which is it has its stats as to what percentage of the population is indigenous. And the main reason for which people identify as indigenous isn't because they speak an indigenous language. It isn't because their parents spoke an indigenous language, even though these are all valid reasons. The most repeated reason for which people consider themselves to be indigenous is because, and this is their words, they are Mexican. And so that self-determination, I think, is fascinating because it throws everything into this mix of where does it start, where does indigeneity end, where do you get to belong to this Mexican culture, and how much ownership do you have over it as Mexico's first woman president of Jewish descent, for example. And I think the answer is the answer that the Mexican Society in the UK gave all those years ago to the University of East Anglia Students' Union, which was actually, if we start subdividing into who gets to wear what, we end up in a terrible, terrible mess. We prefer to err on the side of openness. And I think that's what's interesting, because that makes the debate actually a debate which you've brought to the fore, which is the debate of who gets to determine it on the basis of how much power they have within the existing society. It doesn't matter if you're indigenous, like Benito Juarez, if you impose your ideology from wherever you've got it, that can be an issue. In the same way that the elites, the old elites, might rebel against the new elites coming in who try to shake up their systems, like Claudio Sheinbaum and like Hugo Aguilar. And so I think ultimately who owns culture in Mexico is often determined by who is in power at the time. And right now that we're going through a very big transition into who owns power in Mexico, that's really shaking up the question as to who owns culture in Mexico too. And that's all from us for now. This was Mexico, the podcast. I'm Alex Gonzalez Ormerod.
And I'm Tavo Figueroa. Every 2 weeks, we'll be talking about Mexico, its history, economy, and politics.
And how everything from clothes to food make every Mexican tick. Subscribe to the Mexico Political Economist and find out more about what we've got to say on those topics and much, much more.